Chapter 5 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 5. There was no hard stock in Brandeis' Bazaar now. The packing room was always littered with straw and excelsior dug from hogsheads and great crates. Aloysius lorded it over a small red-headed satellite who disappeared inside barrels and dived head-first into huge boxes, coming up again with a lamp or a doll or a piece of glassware, like a magician. Fanny, perched on an overturned box, used to watch him, fascinated, while he laboriously completed a water set or a tea set. A preliminary dive would bring up the first of half a dozen related pieces, each swathed in tissue paper. A deft twist on the part of the attendant Aloysius would strip the paper wrappings and disclose a ruby-tinted tumbler, perhaps. Another dive and another, until 6 gleaming glasses stood revealed, like chicks without a hen mother. A final dip, much scratching and burrowing, during which armfuls of hay and excelsior were thrown out, and then the red-headed genie of the barrel would emerge, flushed and triumphant, with the water pitcher itself, thus completing the happy family. Aloysius, meanwhile, would regale her with one of those choice bits of gossip he had always about him, like a jewel concealed, and only to be brought out for the appreciative. Mrs. Brandeis disapproved of store gossip, and frowned on Sadie and Pearl whenever she found them, their heads close together, their stifled shrieks testifying to his wit. There were times when Molly Brandeis herself could not resist the spell of his tongue. No one knew where Aloysius got his information. He had news that Winnebago's 2 daily papers never could get, and wouldn't have dared to print if they had. "Did you hear about Myrtle Krieger?" he would begin. "That's marrying the Hempel boy next month. The one in the bank. She's exhibiting her new trousseau at the Outagamie County Fair this week, for the handwork and embroidery prize. Ain't it brazen? They say the crowd's so thick around the table that they had to take down the more personal pieces. The first day of the fair the grandstand was, you might say, empty, even when they was pullin' off the trottin' races and the balloon ascension. It's funny, ain't it, how them garments that you wouldn't turn for a second look at on the clothesline or in a store window becomes kind of wicked and interestin' the minute they get what they call the human note. There it lays, that virgin lingerie, for all the country to look at, with pink ribbons run through everything, and the poor Krieger girl never dreaming she's doing something indelicate. She says yesterday if she wins the prize she's going to put it toward one of those kitchen cabinets." I wish we could stop a while with Aloysius. He is well worth it. Aloysius, who looked a pass between Ichabod Crane and Smike. Aloysius, with his bit of scandal burnished with wit, who after a long, hard Saturday would go home to scrub the floor of the dingy lodgings where he lived with his invalid mother, and who rose in the cold dawn of Sunday mornings to go to early mass, so that he might return to cook the dinner and wait upon the sick woman. Aloysius, whose trousers flapped grotesquely about his bony legs, and whose thin red wrists hung awkwardly from his too short sleeves, had in him that tender, faithful, and courageous stuff of which unsung heroes are made. And he adored his clever, resourceful boss to the point of imitation. You should have seen him trying to sell a sled or a doll's go-cart in her best style. But we cannot stop for Aloysius. He is irrelevant, and irrelevant matter halts the progress of a story. Anyone, from Barrie to Harold Bell Wright, will tell you that a story, to be successful, must march. We'll keep step, then, with Molly Brandeis until she drops out of the ranks. There is no detouring with Mrs. Brandeis for a leader. She is the sort that, once her face is set toward her goal, looks neither to the right nor left until she has reached it. When Fanny Brandeis was 14, and Theodore was not quite 16, a tremendous thing happened. Schabelitz, a famous violinist, came to Winnebago to give a concert under the auspices of the Young Men's Sunday Evening Club. The Young Men's Sunday Evening Club of the Congregational Church prided itself, and justifiably, on what the papers called its auspices. It scorned to present to Winnebago the usual lyceum attractions, Swiss bell ringers, Negro glee clubs, and family fours. Instead, Schumann Heink sang her lieder for them, McCutcheon talked in cartoon for them, Madame Bloomfield Zeisler played. Winnebago was one of those wealthy little Midwestern towns whose people appreciate the best, and set out to acquire it for themselves. To the Easterner, Winnebago and Oshkosh and Kalamazoo and Emporia are names invented to get a laugh from a vaudeville audience. Yet it is the people from Winnebago and Emporia and the like whom you meet in Egypt and the Catalina Islands and at Honolulu and St. Moritz. It is in the Winnebago living room that you are likely to find a prayer rug got in Persia, a bit of gorgeous glaze from China, a scarf from some temple in India, and on it a book, hand-tooled and rare. The Winnebagoans seem to know what is being served and worn, from salad to veilings, surprisingly soon after New York has informed itself on those subjects. The 7:52 Northwestern morning train out of Winnebago was always pretty comfortably crowded with shoppers who were taking a 5-hour run down to Chicago to get a hat and see the new musical show at the Illinois. So Schabelitz's coming was an event, but not an unprecedented one, except to Theodore. Theodore had a ticket for the concert, his mother had seen to that, and he talked of nothing else. He was going with his violin teacher, Emil Bauer. There were strange stories as to why Emil Bauer, with his gift of teaching, should choose to bury himself in this obscure little Wisconsin town. It was known that he had acquaintance with the great and famous of the musical world. The East End set fawned upon him, and his studio suppers were the exclusive social events in Winnebago. Schabelitz was to play in the evening. At 3:30 that afternoon there entered Brandeis' Bazaar a white-faced, wide-eyed boy who was Theodore Brandeis, a plump, voluble, and excited person who was Emil Bauer, and a short, stocky man who looked rather like a foreign-born artisan, plumber or steam-fitter, in his Sunday clothes. This was Levine Schabelitz. Molly Brandeis was selling a wash-boiler to a fussy housewife, who, in her anxiety to assure herself of the flawlessness of her purchase, had done everything but climb inside it. It had early been instilled in the minds of Mrs. Brandeis's children that she was never to be approached when busy with a customer. There were times when they rushed into the store bursting with news or plans, but they had learned to control their eagerness. This, though, was no ordinary news that had blanched Theodore's face. At the sight of the three, Mrs. Brandeis quietly turned her boiler purchaser over to Pearl, and came forward from the rear of the store. "Oh, Mother!" cried Theodore, an hysterical note in his voice. "Oh, Mother!" And in that moment Molly Brandeis knew. Emil Bauer introduced them floridly. Molly Brandeis held out her hand, and her keen brown eyes looked straight and long into the gifted Russian's pale blue ones. According to all rules, he should have started a dramatic speech, beginning with "Madam," hand on heart. But Schabelitz the Great had sprung from Schabelitz the peasant boy, and in the process he had managed, somehow, to retain the simplicity which was his charm. Still, there was something queer and foreign in the way he bent over Mrs. Brandeis's hand. We do not bow like that in Winnebago. "Mrs. Brandeis, I am honored to meet you." "And I to meet you," replied the shopkeeper in the black sateen apron. "I have just had the pleasure of hearing your son play," began Schabelitz. "Mr. Bauer called me out of my economics class at school, Mother, and said that—" "Theodore!" Theodore subsided. "He is only a boy," went on Schabelitz, and put one hand on Theodore's shoulder. "A very gifted boy. I hear hundreds. Oh, how I suffer sometimes to hear their devilish scraping. Today my friend Bauer met me with that old plea. 'You must hear this pupil play. He has genius.' 'Bah! Genius,' I said, and I swore at him a little, for he is my friend, Bauer. But I went with him to his studio. 'Bauer, that is a remarkable fine place you have there, above that drug store. A room of exceptional proportions. And those rugs, let me tell you.' 'Never mind the rugs, Schabelitz. Mrs. Brandeis here.' 'Oh, yes, yes. Well, dear lady, this boy of yours will be a great violinist if he is willing to work, and work, and work. He has what you in America call the spark. To make it a flame, he must work, always work. You must send him to Dresden under our—'" "Dresden!" echoed Molly Brandeis faintly, and put one hand on the table that held the fancy cups and saucers, and they jingled a little. "A year, perhaps, first in New York with Wolfson." Wolfson! New York! Dresden! It was too much even for Molly Brandeis's well-balanced brain. She was conscious of feeling a little dizzy. At that moment Pearl approached apologetically. "Pardon me, Miss Brandeis, but Mrs. Trost wants to know if you'll send the broiler special this afternoon. She wants it for the washing early tomorrow morning." That served to steady her. "Tell Mrs. Trost I'll send it before 6 tonight." Her eyes rested on Theodore's face, flushed now and glowing. Then she turned and faced Schabelitz squarely. "Perhaps you do not know that this store is our support. I earn a living here for myself and my 2 children. You see what it is, just a novelty and notion store in a country town. I speak of this because it is the important thing. I have known for a long time that Theodore's playing was not the playing of the average boy, musically gifted. So what you tell me does not altogether surprise me. But when you say Dresden, well, From Brandeis's Bazaar in Winnebago, Wisconsin, to our in Dresden, Germany, is a long journey for one afternoon. But of course you must have time to think it over. It must be brought about, somehow. Somehow. Mrs. Brandeis stared straight ahead, and you could almost hear that indomitable will of hers working, crashing over obstacles, plowing through difficulties. Theodore watched her breathless, as though expecting an immediate solution. His mother's eyes met his own intent ones, and at that her mobile mouth quirked in a sudden smile. You look as if you expected pearls to drop out of my mouth, son. And by the way, if you're going to a concert this evening, don't you think it would be a good idea to squander an hour on study this afternoon? You may be a musical prodigy, but geometry's geometry. Oh, Mother, please! I want to talk to Mr. Schabelitz and Mr. Bauer alone. She patted his shoulder, and the last pat ended in a gentle push. Run along. I'll work, Mother. You know perfectly well I'll work. And he looked so startling like his father as he said it that Mrs. Brandeis felt a clutching at her heart. Theodore out of the way, they seemed to find very little to discuss, after all. Schabelitz was so quietly certain, Bauer so triumphantly proud. Said Schabelitz, Wilson, of course, receives $10 a lesson ordinarily. $10? But a pupil like Theodore is in the nature of an investment, Bauer hastened to explain. An advertisement. After hearing him play, and after what Schabelitz here will have to say for him, Wolfson will certainly give Theodore lessons for nothing, or next to nothing. You remember, proudly, I offered to teach him without charge, but you would not have it. Schabelitz smote his friend sharply on the shoulder. The true musician. Oh, Bauer, Bauer, that you should bury yourself in this. But Bauer stopped him with a gesture. Mrs. Brandeis is a busy woman, and as she says, this thing needs thinking over. After all, said Mrs. Brandeis, there isn't much to think about. I know just where I stand. It's a case of mathematics, that's all. This business of mine is just beginning to pay. From now on I shall be able to save something every year. It might be enough to cover his musical education. It might mean that Fanny, my daughter, and I would have to give up everything. For myself, I would be only too happy, too proud. But it doesn't seem fair to her. After all, a girl— It isn't fair, broke in Schabelitz. It isn't fair. But that is the way of genius. It never is fair. It takes and takes and takes. I know. My mother could tell you if she were alive. She sold the little farm, and my sisters gave up their dowries, and with them their hopes of marriage, and they lived on bread and cabbage. That was not to pay for my lessons. They never could have done that. It was only to send me to Moscow. We were very poor. They must have starved. I have come to know since that it was not worth it, that nothing could be worth it. But it was worth it. Your mother would do it over again if she had the chance. That's what we're for. Bauer pulled at his watch and uttered a horrified exclamation. Himmel, 4 o'clock, and I have a pupil at 4. He turned hastily to Mrs. Brandeis. I am giving a little supper in my studio after the concert tonight. Oh, Gott, groaned Schabelitz. It is in honor of Schabelitz here. You see how overcome he is. Will you let me bring Theodore back with me after the concert? There will be some music, and perhaps he will play for us. Schabelitz bent again in his queer little foreign bow. And you, of course, will honor us, Mrs. Brandeis. He had never lived in Winnebago. Oh, certainly, Bauer hastened to say. He had. I. Molly Brandeis looked down at her apron and stroked it with her fingers. Then she looked up with a little smile that was not so pleasant as her smile usually was. There had flashed across her quick mind a picture of Mrs. G. Manville Smith. Mrs. G. Manville Smith, in an evening gown whose décolletage was discussed from the Haley House to Gerritson's department store next morning, was always a guest at Bauer's studio affairs. Thank you, but it is impossible. And Theodore is only a schoolboy. Just now he needs, more than anything else in the world, 9 hours of sleep every night. There will be plenty of time for studio suppers later. When a boy's voice is changing, and he doesn't know what to do with his hands and feet, he is better off at home. Gott, these mothers! Exclaimed Schabelitz. What do they not know? I suppose you're right. Bauer was both rueful and relieved. It would have been fine to show off Theodore as his pupil and Schabelitz's protégé, but Mrs. Brandeis? No, that would never do. Well, I must go. We will talk about this again, Mrs. Brandeis. In 2 weeks, Schabelitz will pass through Winnebago again on his way back to Chicago. Meanwhile, he will write Wolfson. I also. So, come, Schabelitz. He turned to see that gentleman strolling off in the direction of the notion counter behind which his expert eye had caught a glimpse of Sadie in her white shirtwaist and her trim skirt. Sadie always knew what they were wearing on State Street, Chicago, half an hour after Mrs. Brandeis returned from one of her buying trips. Shirtwaists had just come in, and with them those neat leather belts with a buckle, and about the throat they were wearing folds of white satin ribbon, smooth and high and tight, the two ends tied pertly at the back. Sadie would never be the salesman that Pearl was, but her unfailing good nature and her cheery self-confidence made her an asset in the store. Besides, she was pretty. Mrs. Brandeis knew the value of a pretty clerk. At the approach of this stranger, Sadie leaned coyly against the stocking rack and patted her paper sleevelets that were secured at wrist and elbow with elastic bands. Her method was sure death to traveling men. She prepared now to try it on the world-famous virtuoso. The ease with which she succeeded surprised even Sadie, accustomed though she was to conquest. "Come, come, Schabelitz," said Bauer again. "I must get going." "Then go, my friend. Go along and make your preparations for that studio supper. The only interesting women in Winnebago," he bowed to Mrs. Brandeis, "will not be there. I know them, these small-town society women and their imitation city ways. And Pony, always. I am enjoying myself. I shall stay here." And he did stay. Sadie, talking it over afterward with Pearl and Aloysius, put it thus. "They say he is the grandest violin player in the world. Not that I care much for the violin myself. Kind of squeaky, I always think. But it just goes to show they're all alike. Ain't it the truth? I jollied him just like I did Sam Bloom of Gants and Pick Novelties an hour before. He laughed just where Sam did. And they both handed me a line of talk about my hair and eyes, only Sam said I was a doll, and this Schabelitz, or whatever his name is, said I was as alluring as a Lorelei. I guess he thought he had me there. But I didn't go through the seventh reader for nothing. If you think I'm flattered, I said to him, you're mistaken. She was the mess that used to sit out on that rock, with her black hair down, combing away and singing like mad, keeping an eye out for sailors up and down the river. If I had to work that hard to get some attention, I said, I'd give up the struggle and settle down with a cat and a tea kettle. At that he just threw back his head and roared, and when Mrs. Brandeis came up, he said something about the wit of these American women. Work is a great sharpener of wit and wits, Mrs. Brandeis said to him. Pearl, did Aloysius send Eddie out with that boiler special? And she didn't pay any more attention to him, or make any more fuss over him, than she would to a traveler with a line of samples she wasn't interested in. I guess that's why he had such a good time. Sadie was right. That was the reason. Fanny, coming into the store half an hour later, saw this man who had swayed thousands with his music, down on his hands and knees in the toy section at the rear of Brandeis's Bazaar. He and Sadie and Aloysius were winding up toy bears and clowns and engines and carriages, and sending them madly racing across the floor. Sometimes their careening career was threatened with disaster in the form of a clump of brooms or a stack of galvanized pails, but Schabelitz would scramble forward with a shout and rescue them just before the crash came, and set them deftly off again in the opposite direction. "This I must have for my boy in New York." He held up a miniature hook and ladder. "In this windmill that whirls so busily. My Leo is 7, and his head is full of engines and motors and things that run on wheels. He cares no more for music, the little savage, than the son of a bricklayer." "Who is that man?" Fanny whispered, staring at him. "Levine Schabelitz." "Schabelitz? Not the—" "Yes." "But he's playing on the floor like a little boy, and laughing. My mother, he's just like anybody else, only nicer." If Fanny had been more than 14, her mother might have told her that all really great people are like that, finding joy in simple things. I think that is the secret of their genius, the child in them that keeps their viewpoint fresh, and that makes us children again when we listen to them. It is the Schabelitzes of this world who can shout over a toy engine that would bore a Bauer to death. Fanny stood looking at him thoughtfully. She knew all about him. Theodore's talk of the past week had accomplished that. Fanny knew that here was a man who did one thing better than anyone else in the world. She thrilled to that thought. She adored the quality in people that caused them to excel. Schabelitz had got hold of a jack-in-the-box, and each time the absurd head popped out with its grin and its squawk, he laughed like a boy. Fanny, standing behind the wrapping counter and leaning on it with her elbows the better to see this great man, smiled too, as her flexible spirit and her mobile mind caught his mood. She did not know she was smiling. Neither did she know why she suddenly frowned in the intensity of her concentration, reached up for one of the pencils on the desk next to the wrapping counter, and bent over the topmost sheet of yellow wrapping paper that lay spread out before her. Her tongue-tip curled excitedly at one corner of her mouth. Her head was cocked to one side. She was rapidly sketching a crude and startling likeness of Levin Schabelitz as he stood there with the ridiculous toy in his hand. It was a trick she often amused herself with at school. She had drawn her school-teacher one day as she had looked when gazing up into the eyes of the visiting superintendent, who was a married man. Quite innocently and unconsciously she had caught the adoring look in the eyes of Miss McCook, the teacher, and that lady, happening upon the sketch later, had dealt with Fanny in a manner seemingly unwarranted. In the same way, it was not only the exterior likeness of the man which she was catching now, the pompadour that stood stiffly perpendicular like a brush, the square yellow peasant teeth, the strong slender hands and wrists, the stocky figure, the high cheekbones, the square-toed foreign-looking shoes, and the trousers too wide at the instep to have been cut by an American tailor. She caught and transmitted to paper, in some uncanny way, the simplicity of the man who was grinning at the jack-in-the-box that smirked back at him. Behind the veneer of poise and polish born of success and adulation she had caught a glimpse of the Russian peasant boy delighted with the crude toy in his hand, and she put it down eagerly, wetting her pencil between her lips, shading here, erasing there. Mrs. Brandeis, bustling up to the desk for a customer's change, and with a fancy dish to be wrapped in her hand, glanced over Fanny's shoulder. She leaned closer. "Why, Fanny, you witch!" Fanny gave a little crow of delight, and tossed her head in a way that switched her short curls back from where they had fallen over her shoulders. "It's like him, isn't it?" "It looks more like him than he does himself." With which Molly Brandeis unconsciously defined the art of cartooning. Fanny looked down at it, a smile curving her lips. Mrs. Brandeis, dish in hand, counted her change expertly from the till below the desk, and reached for the sheet of wrapping paper just beneath that on which Fanny had made her drawing. At that moment Schabelitz, glancing up, saw her, and came forward smiling, the jack-in-the-box still in his hand. "Dear lady, I hope I have not entirely disorganized your shop. I've had a most glorious time. Would you believe it, this jack-in-the-box looks exactly, but exactly like my manager Ferber when the box-office receipts are good. He grins just—" And then his eyes fell on the drawing that Fanny was trying to cover with one brown paw. "Hello, what's this?" Then he looked at Fanny. Then he grasped her wrist in his fingers of steel and looked at the sketch that grinned back at him impishly. "Well, I'm damned!" exploded Schabelitz in amusement and surprise and appreciation, and did not apologize. "And who is this young lady with the sense of humor?" "This is my little girl, Fanny." He looked down at the rough sketch again, with its clean-cut satire, and up again at the little girl in the school coat and the faded red tam-o'-shanter, who was looking at him shyly and defiantly and provokingly all at once. "Your little girl Fanny, The one who is to give up everything that the boy Theodore may become a great violinist?" He bent again over the crude, effective cartoon, then put a forefinger gently under the child's chin, and tipped her glowing face up to the light. "I am not so sure now that will work. As for its being fair, why, no, no." Fanny waited for her mother that evening, and they walked home together. Their step and swing were very much alike, now that Fanny's legs were growing longer. She was at the backfiche age. "What did he mean, Mother, when he said that about Theodore being a great violinist, and its not being fair? What isn't fair? And how did he happen to be in the store, anyway? He bought a heap of toys, didn't he? I suppose he's awfully rich." "Tonight, when Theodore's at the concert, I'll tell you what he meant, and all about it." "I'd love to hear him play, wouldn't you? I'd just love to." Over Molly Brandeis's face there came a curious look. "You could hear him, Fanny, in Theodore's place. Theodore would have to stay home if I told him to." Fanny's eyes and mouth grew round with horror. "Theodore stay home? Why, Mrs. Molly Brandeis!" Then she broke into a little relieved laugh. "But you're just fooling, of course." "No, I'm not. If you really want to go, I'll tell Theodore to give up his ticket to his sister." "Well, my goodness! I guess I'm not a pig. I wouldn't have Theodore stay home, not for $1,000,000. "I knew you wouldn't," said Molly Brandeis as they swung down Norris Street, and she told Fanny briefly of what Schabelitz had said about Theodore. It was typical of Theodore that he ate his usual supper that night. He may have got his excitement vicariously from Fanny. She was thrilled enough for two. Her food lay almost untouched on her plate. She chattered incessantly. When Theodore began to eat his second baked apple with cream, her outraged feelings voiced their protest. "But, Theodore, I don't see how you can." "Can what?" "Eat like that. when you're going to hear him play, and after what he said, and everything." "Well, is that any reason why I should starve to death?" "But I don't see how you can," repeated Fanny helplessly, and looked at her mother. Mrs. Brandeis reached for the cream pitcher and poured a little more cream over Theodore's baked apple. Even as she did it her eyes met Fanny's, and in them was a certain sly amusement, a little gleam of fun, a look that said, "Neither do I." Fanny sat back satisfied. Here, at least, was someone who understood. At 7:30 Theodore, looking very brushed and sleek, went off to meet Emil Bauer. Mrs. Brandeis had looked him over and had said, "Your nails!" and sent him back to the bathroom, and she had resisted the desire to kiss him, because Theodore disliked demonstration. He hated to be pawed over, was the way he put it. After he had gone, Mrs. Brandeis went into the dining room where Fanny was sitting. Mattie had cleared the table, and Fanny was busy over a book and a tablet by the light of the lamp which they always used for studying. It was one of the rare occasions when she had brought home a school lesson. It was arithmetic, and Fanny loathed arithmetic. She had no head for mathematics. The set of problems were eighth-grade horrors, in which A is digging into a well 20 feet deep and 9 feet wide, or in which A and B are papering 2 rooms, or building 2 fences, or plastering a wall. If A does his room in 9½ days, the room being 12 feet high, 20 feet long, and 15½ feet wide, how long will it take B to do a room 14 feet high, 11¾ feet, etc.? Fanny hated the indefatigable A and B with a bitter personal hatred. And as for that occasional person named C, who complicated matters still more! Sometimes Mrs. Brandeis helped to disentangle Fanny from the mazes of her wallpaper problems, or dragged her up from the bottom of the well when it seemed that she was down there for eternity unless a friendly hand rescued her. As a rule, she insisted that Fanny crack her own mathematical nuts. She said it was good mental training, not to speak of the moral side of it. But tonight she bent her quick mind upon the problems that were puzzling her little daughter, and cleared them up in no time. When Fanny had folded her arithmetic papers neatly inside her book and leaned back with a relieved sigh, Molly Brandeis bent forward in the lamplight and began to talk very soberly. Fanny, red-cheeked and bright-eyed from her recent mental struggles, listened interestedly, then intently, then absorbedly. She attempted to interrupt sometimes with an occasional, "But, Mother, how?" But Mrs. Brandeis shook her head and went on. She told Fanny a few things about her early married life, things that made Fanny look at her with new eyes. She had always thought of her mother as her mother, in the way a 14-year-old girl does. It never occurred to her that this mother person, who was so capable, so confident, so worldly wise, had once been a very young bride, with her life before her, and her hopes stepping high, and her love keeping time with her hopes. Fanny heard, fascinated, the story of this girl who had married against the advice of her family and her friends. Molly Brandeis talked curtly and briefly, and her very brevity and lack of embroidering details made the story stand out with stark realism. It was such a story of courage and pride and indomitable will and sheer pluck as can only be found among the seemingly commonplace. "And so," she finished, "I used to wonder sometimes whether it was worth while to keep on, and what it was all for, and now I know. Theodore is going to make up for everything. Only we'll have to help him first. It's going to be hard on you, Fanchen. I'm talking to you as if you were 18 instead of 14, but I want you to understand. That isn't fair to you either, my expecting you to understand. Only I don't want you to hate me too much when you're a woman and I'm gone and you'll remember." "Why, Mother, what in the world are you talking about? Hate you?" "For what I took from you to give him, Fanny. You don't understand now. Things must be made easy for Theodore. It will mean that you and I will have to scrimp and save. Not now and then, but all the time. It will mean that we can't go to the theater even occasionally, or to lectures or concerts. It will mean that your clothes won't be as pretty or as new as the other girls' clothes. You'll sit on the front porch evenings and watch them go by, and you'll want to go, too." "As if I cared!" "But you will care. I know. I know. It's easy enough to talk about sacrifice in a burst of feeling, but it's the everyday, shriveling grind that's hard. You'll want the clothes and books and beau and education, and you ought to have them. There you're right. You ought to have them." Suddenly Molly Brandeis's arms were folded on the table, and her head came down on her arms, and she was crying, quietly, horribly, as a man cries. Fanny stared at her a moment in unbelief. She had not seen her mother cry since the day of Ferdinand Brandeis's death. She scrambled out of her chair and thrust her head down next to her mother's, so that her hot, smooth cheek touched the wet, cold one. "Mother, don't! Don't, Molly dearie. I can't bear it. I'm going to cry, too. Do you think I care for old dresses and things? I should say not. It's going to be fun going without things. It'll be like having a secret or something. Now stop, and let's talk about it." Molly Brandeis wiped her eyes and sat up and smiled. It was a watery and wavering smile, but it showed that she was mistress of herself again. "No," she said, "we just won't talk about it any more. I'm tired, and that's what's the matter with me, and I haven't sense enough to know it. I'll tell you what. I'm going to put on my kimono, and you'll make some fudge, will you? We'll have a party all by ourselves, and if Mattie scolds about the milk tomorrow, you just tell her I said you could. And I think there are some walnut meats in the third cocoa can on the shelf in the pantry. Use 'em all." End of chapter 5.